Hello dear viewers of my channel, with you Evgeny, and today we will talk about how to significantly improve the speed of memory and understand the reference overclocking. By this I mean something different from a simple rigid approach with setting the maximum voltage with a rigid timing assignment, which requires an expensive motherboard with a large number of layers of textilite. Because in fact, the usual approach in the case of using 4 modules does not work as well as in the case of 2 modules, especially in the case of using large volume DDR5 sticks, which usually operate at a fairly modest frequency. Somewhere you may come across circuit numbers with overclocking 4 modules with a wild heating of the memory, but in this video we will consider an option on how to overclock DDR5 on the LGA1700 socket without permanent fierce heating of the memory modules. Before moving on the very essence of the phenomenon, it is worth mentioning that everything described works on a configuration with an MSI Z790A Pro Wi-Fi motherboard, a 12900K processor with the most ordinary memory modules. There will be a lot of information so that even beginners can figure it all out. Discovering this taking several weeks of only focus on this all the time, just to try everything possible, cause no one before did this, and several weeks more to prepare explanation of how to make RAM working. This not provide extreme benefit in speed for cheap RAM sticks since they are already getting almost cap of speed, but still viable for those who wants to explore this theme since there is no one else succeed and shown its progress. And the very first requirement for increasing the speed of working with RAM is that in order for DDR5 memory and the memory controller to work at the same frequency, that is in Gear 1 mode, you will need to fill all 4 slots on the motherboard with memory modules. Only in this case will it be possible to get an officially unsupported operating mode with a 1:1 ratio of the controller and RAM frequency and undergo memory training. Probably for 2-slot motherboards, the option with dual rank modules will work, in which the chips are located on both sides, like on 32GB modules, but I have not checked this, so for now we will assume that 4 single rank memory modules are required on a 4-slot motherboard. In order to run the memory in the basic mode at the frequency of the memory controller in Gear 1 mode, nothing supernatural is required, although I did this with memory modules without radiators. But heated modules under radiators with simple thermal pads may refuse to start even at a base frequency of 4800 MHz. Therefore, it is advisable not to rush anywhere. Let the modules cool down if something did not work the first time, and only then try again. Memory training in Gear 1 mode is a rather stressful situation, but since in this case the hub temperature which we can observe by the sensors will be lower than the temperature of the chips, you will need to create conditions for their launch. If nothing works at all, you can remove the modules and put them into refrigerator so that their temperature becomes low enough to undergo memory training. But in my case, lowering the temperature of the modules did not particularly affect the probability of training compared to a temperature of about 25 degrees at the hub. And in the cold season, you can simply open the window, leaving for a while not only the modules for blowing cold air, but the entire computer, since the board temperature apparently also affects the probability of memory training in overclocking models. With a base frequency of 4800 to 5400 MHz only. Moreover, the condition may be such that you can also complete the training at a normal temperature, but at maximum frequencies, the chance is usually low. If this is not enough, the processor, or more precisely the memory controller, becomes too hot during memory training, and you should either turn off turbo boost technology or perform a full undervolt or update the motherboard firmware. In the case of MSI, when loading before loading the operating system, the voltage without undervolting can be quite high, and you will probably have to do something with an adjustment for the motherboard power style. The lack of official support for the Gear 1 mode on the Intel platform may mean that Intel did not have enough brains to be able to launch this mode, which is officially impossible and was preserved in the BIOS of motherboards on LGA1700s with DDR5 rather as a residual principle due to laziness, so that everything was like in motherboards on DDR4. Therefore, the presence of such a mode in the BIOS of the motherboard for the LGA 1851 platform is not guaranteed, and what I saw says that such a mode was simply cut out of the BIOS, but craftsmen will probably be able to return it since the BIOS of the motherboard is still subject to intervention, and the memory controller is unlikely to have changed much. When overclocking, the difference between the usual approach to overclocking and the one required for overclocking memory in Gear 1 mode is that you need to act carefully and accurately. You don't need to immediately set the maximum voltage to 1.4 volts and overclock everything to the maximum, and it would most likely be a wrong step, since you should not start with the highest frequencies. First, it is advisable to find the parameters that allow you to run the memory at the base frequency, then at an increased frequency, and only then move on, since the complexity of overclocking is much higher than with overclocking two memory modules. The main difficulty is that people are usually used to sharply overstating the voltage, setting the maximum allowable voltage for memory modules. In fact, a verified voltage allocation is required, suitable for maintaining operation at a given frequency. The memory simply will not start at too high voltage values, as well as at too low values, but the advantages of this method are that this approach, compared to the usual overclocking of a pair of modules, greatly reduces the heating of the power circuits on the memory modules. In addition, with high main timings, for example 40-40-40-80, the voltage of the system agent may need to be reduced, or the timings lowered to 38-38-38-76. The combination of the first and last timings is important here, since according to observations, not its reduction but their relative values given a better result. Although the last two timings refer to the same phenomenon when the delay is set and one of them should be low, but the last one usually cannot be halved. Now let's go down to business, and the first non-obvious subtlety is where to start overclocking the RAM in Gear 1 mode. In the case of DDR5 on MSI boards, you must first set the SAGV or System Agent Geyser value to enabled in advanced RAM configuration, because without this the memory will not work in Gear 1 mode. The second non-obvious point is that before doing anything further, you should set the voltage for the system agent, which may also be called VCCSA on other boards, by exiting the memory configuration and finding the CPU SA voltage field below on MSI boards. In automatic mode on a processor with the K index, the auto mode can greatly increase the voltage, and therefore to set the voltage you should use the override mode, leaving it at the standard value, which works directly so that the voltage does not go up to the ceiling if this is not required, since it can even work better when reducing the voltage by 100 millivolts or more through offset at a memory frequency of 4800 MHz. After setting these settings in a suitable configuration with 4 memory modules, the processor memory controller mode in Gear 1 will become available. That is, at twice the frequency of the processor memory controller. It is the memory controller that is the main one in the pair of memory controller, the RAM itself. It is also worth paying attention to the GT voltage for the integrated graphics. If there is an offset or adaptive mode, this can lead to artifacts, freezes and other problems, since in fact these voltages are interconnected and you cannot set a low voltage for the integrated video card with a higher voltage for the system agent. So in overclocking mode, the integrated video card should usually be left as is in automatic mode. In my case, 4 modules of 16 GB were limited by modules on Micron chips. Usually the ceiling for such memory modules when overclocked is up to 5400 MHz, but it is extremely difficult to achieve it, and you should first reach a frequency of 5200 MHz, since the modules themselves are declared as 4800 MHz. In my case, to nominally rise to 400 MHz, it was necessary to increase the voltage of the memory by at least 10 millivolts to a value of 1.110 volts with the main timings of 40. At such voltage, the system behaves unstable and is suitable only for light loads, unless you increase the voltage on the system agent to 1.010 volts, which is impossible to do on processors without the K index, after which errors in memtest 86 cease to appear during hourly testing, which gives 8 passes of the last most difficult test, which also depends on the value of the timing responsible for rest. That is a common parameter for all RAM, and it should be within certain limits, not too high but not low either. That is, you can't raise it at a random and get a working system, but it is more a description of trial steps. To achieve the effect of stability in games, a voltage of 1.150 on VDD and 1.130 on VDDQ was required, and when using chip gaskets with an installed radiator, even at frequency of 4800 MHz, the DDR5 value has to be reduced from the maximum. It is especially worth noting that if the voltage is not enough, then the game, which should go fast, will feel slow as in water. If you do not reduce the VDQ value, constant stutters will be observed, especially if you add the recording via OBS with a hardware encoder of the integrated graphics, which will once again increase the number of stutters even without previewing, and with previewing the process will be completely jerky. This point is quite important since, in fact, the VDDQ voltage affects stability, while the lack of voltage on VDD leads to freezes during operation under load, that is, to operability but not stability. You probably often could observe slowdowns in games. With open chips, this happens at 36 degrees near the hub, that is, the temperature on the chips can be more than 55 degrees. Maybe in Gear 2 mode this is not so pronounced, but the fact remains. The temperature regime is important for DDR5. Here it is also worth noting that vertical synchronization greatly adds latency, and therefore to achieve the same sharpness without using it you will have to overclock the memory a lot, but to have sharpness even at 16 frames per second you need to use hybrid graphics, that is, a pair of video cards, integrated graphics plus a discrete video card, about which there was already a large video. Having those achieved the transition from 4800 MHz to 5200 MHz and reduced latency, you can work on timings to reduce the latency to about 60 nanoseconds. Two especially important timings in this case which had to be selected are the main two, which gave the main effect. This is TVTR, which was set to 7 auto. It works with value of 3 or 4 at a frequency of 5200 MHz, but due to low values, various problems appear, and therefore it is enough to leave it at 6, and you can consider that almost everything is done. Although its reduction can affect the stability of operating, and programs may, for example, not start. That is, the automatically selected delays surprisingly turn out to be very close to the desired ones. In the test, the delay was reduced precisely from this timing in addition to the main one. And the most important thing, of course, is to set the maximum value of tier 5 field if you want to reduce the memory latency as much as possible. The board itself will reduce it to 262,143, and usually this value cannot be set higher since apparently the data need to be maintained in memory and spend more time on it in the commonly used Gear 1, Gear 2 mode, which does not apply to the Gear 1 mode, and there are boards that have a maximum value 4 times less on older BIOS versions. But for stability you will probably have to lower the values if problems are observed. During normal overclocking of two models, the tier 5 parameter is not exactly ignored, but as a rule, they do not try to set it to the maximum value, stating that it does not work properly. Although, in fact, even open models can work at a maximum value. The ratio of frequency and tier 5 value is more important here, and probably a slightly lower frequency with a higher tier 5 value can give a better result for most scenarios. Although there is usually a linear increase in performance from the memory frequency. In fact, this pair of TVTR and TRFI provide the main decrease in latency. The TRFC2 timing at low VPP voltage will have to be raised to 543, although this value can be lowered after adjustment. And TRFC-PB to 390 or 335, and you should be careful with the latter, since its underestimated value may require a BIOS reset, and before changing it, it is advisable to at least save the existing BIOS settings profile. With too high parameters, the last two timings will also not allow the system to start, since setting the maximum TRFI value and making too long pauses with these two timings is not something that is combined in practice, but they can be increased to a certain extent if there are problems with stability at high TRFI values, especially if there is no desire or opportunity to increase the voltage on the system agent. In fact, they will slightly increase the delay when increasing, which may be more beneficial for maintaining the maximum TRFI value. It is advisable to select these two values so that they are divisible by 8 and set the value 1 lower, since the reference point in the BIOS starts from 0, and usually when overclocking the value is set by mistake by 1 higher, and therefore they do not understand why they have strange problems with stability. But the maximum value in the BIOS is odd, which means the reference point starts from 0, not from 1, and for stability it is desirable that the value be a multiple of 8. Then, after testing, you can reduce the first main timings cast latency or CL to 38 and the last one to 76. Well, most likely you will not be able to reduce the peak voltage VPP, since in full mode these voltage values may periodically occur. Enabling repeated memory training seems pointless, since it is done anyway on cold memory, and therefore it is better to disable this option and repeat the memory training process after a while, when the memory has cooled down, since repeated training almost always fails, which takes more time, which in turn requires taking longer breaks to cool the memory to the optimal temperature. This is certainly not a quick process for checking each timing, but you already have some guidelines. It is pointless to train the memory every time by disabling the fast boot option, so it is highly advisable to enable it. You should be careful with the TRFC2 and especially TRFC-PB timings, since incorrect values may require resetting the BIOS settings, and before setting them you should find a way to reset the BIOS if possible without removing the video card and battery, with the system unit disconnected from the mains, or by turning off the power on the power supply. Usually it is enough to short circuit a couple of jumpers with a screwdriver, but it is still better to do this carefully and with the power off. Still, Gear 1 mode actually reduces the time required to transfer data by 2 times, and in fact delays are reduced by half. You can also calculate them using the formula 1000 split 1000 200 multiply 40. You will get a figure of 32.3233 nanoseconds. For DDR5, it is extremely important to work in Gear 1 mode, despite the fact that when increasing the frequency with timings, the delay still decreases, since the memory bandwidth still grows and can reach values equivalent to frequencies of 6000 MHz and higher at much lower frequencies and voltage. The memory controller is cooled together with the processor and its heat dissipation is extremely low, and even with high voltage set on system agent, the heating can easily be covered by an air cooler, but memory models have a much more difficult time and you will have to cool the memory very seriously, and therefore a bias towards memory is fraught with high costs, including the purchase of liquid cooling for the processor, real radiators for memory, high quality gasket, and a fan for memory. When overclocking to 5400 MHz, very strong heat dissipation begins, although achieving it causes problems since it is necessary to set the memory interleaving option in the advanced memory settings, and only then, after the memory cools down, it can undergo training, and all because it is necessary to add voltage on top of to the base voltage, and modules without radiators begin to heat up very much. And they heat up because they really work, and in order to simply boot up, you need to wait for cooling on the boot screen, boot up to the login screen, and let the models cool down again, and only when then will it be possible to boot up and see something in the system if radiators are not installed. At the same time, any more or less slight load will easily overheat the memory modules, so it is no longer safe to set such high values on open modules, although the modules themselves undergo training more often. For simple work and games, this should be enough. Thermal pads and thermal capacity of the installed radiator allow you to eliminate obvious overheating during operation, but the issue of cooling 4 modules is a completely different task than 2 with a dense arrangement of RAM sticks. They can also interfere with memory training, and no amount of blowing can fix this, and for extreme overclocking you may need water cooling of the memory, since already at frequency of 4400 MHz the modules can be unstable. People who are used to seeing such frequencies should pay attention to delays and the fact that usually wild memory overclocking is done only to show numbers and not for practical use. I conducted tests on Linux, and here the level of delay is also related to how quickly the kernel processes requests, and the difference between the real-time kernel 6.10 and the regular kernel 6.12 is about 2.5 nanoseconds in favor of the newer kernel. Also, a special bonus for those who use Linux is that using Intel pstate, which is officially declared as a program that interferes with the scheduler to transfer the load from large cores to small ones, in fact, in additionally reduces the memory latency by 2.5 nanoseconds. So it is worth simply enabling this option even if the declared functions are not officially supported with multi-threading enabled. Perhaps Intel has not yet figured out how to slow down processors which, like the operating mode in Gear 1 are not supported. The expediency of all this is that, for example, on the Z690 chipset, it is very difficult to overclock the memory in frequency, but in Gear 1 mode, very high frequencies are not required. Cool memory with XMP profile at 7800 MHz may not work at the tested frequency, and the memory potential will be wasted if the chipset or the number of motherboard layers do not allow using high frequencies of RAM. But most likely such memory is distinguished only by its high price, and in real operation at the first speed, expensive models will not differ in any way from cheap ones, creating difficulties in cooling with their radiators, since manufacturers of even kits of 4 modules do not bother themselves with spacing the radiators with thermal pads, since too close placement of modules with wide radiators can almost completely block the air that could pass between the radiators. And with passive cooling, it is important to have both sufficiently thick radiators with high quality thermal pads and to have a distance of several millimeters between the modules. And this can only be arranged by manually assembling the cooling using thermal pads of different thickness. After all, when assembling on our own, we have the opportunity to place the radiators at a distance of about 3 millimeters from each other, and at the same time use the distance between pairs of slots. For this, a thick thermal pad or several layers of a standard thickness of 1 millimeter are used on the chips of the memory module in the first slot, but the heat pipes of a dual tower cooler can limit this space. In the fourth slot, the thinnest thermal pad goes to the memory, and the thick one goes to the backside. When using dual rank modules, only the thickness of the second thermal pad changes. This allows you to drop a few degrees from the memory and allow it to cool faster. Also, when using a dual tower cooler with a 140 mm fan, you can use nippers to bite off the lower part of the cooler, preserving the mounts on the radiator to cool the memory, since it will not be possible to install a fan on the memory from above in this case. And in normal mode, part of the air flow is blocked. Together with the separation of the radiators, when using high quality thermal pads, this provides a sufficient level of memory cooling. Also, when using thick radiators, it is worth manually setting the optimal tilt of the modules in the slot if they allow it. If possible, moving the radiators apart, otherwise the memory may not cool even during a very long idle time, since there may be no contact between the radiators and the air will categorically not have enough space for convection, and heat dissipation may be extremely slow. The cooling problem may be that most often the memory itself is passed by the manufacturer with a warranty on the chips themselves in order to prevent people from installing cooling on cheap models. But this not fully apply on to the memory chip manufacturers Samsung and Hynix. Their native green models apparently differ in quality, and therefore the stickers on Samsung models for 16 GB are above the memory chips, while the Hynix stickers is on the back of the model. These two companies produce honest models with a frequency of 5600 MHz operating at a voltage of 1.1 volts, and not fakes that work in overclocking and are the same models at 4800 MHz from third-party chip packers. But Hynix memory, as more interesting, will not be easy to get, probably. Therefore, a safe option is models from Samsung with a base frequency of 5600 MHz, but they are slightly inferior in speed to the memory from SK Hynix. No matter what new memory comes out for overclocking in Gear 1, the only important thing is that what base frequency the module maintain at a base voltage of 1.1 volts. Memory capable of operating at a frequency of 8000 MHz at a voltage of 1.1 volts will of course fit into any system, but it is worth understanding that the motherboard may consider simple operation at a high memory frequencies as overclocking, and may resist memory operation at a high frequency even at a low voltages, since usually for high frequency models overclocking with voltage increase is used, but in the case of high quality models this is not exactly required, and yet the operating frequency may be extremely limited, and even 7000 MHz may be unattainable on boards with 6 layers of textile, and even more so problems may occur on the boards with the Z690 chipset. I use a JE radiator for cooling, which are milled from a piece of aluminum with thermal pads from Techno Himlab. For those who already have models with thin radiators, there is an option on how to fix this if you have a fairly compact cooler. To do this, you need to take hexagonal spacers that are screwed in two places on the motherboard under the RAM, simultaneously pressing the board and allowing you to install a standard 90mm fan on top. The spacers are quite cheap and their length can be selected on or screwed several on top of each other so that the fan is located as close as possible to the memory modules. They have long been used to mount motherboards in chip cases, but no one forbids using them to mount something else on top of the motherboard. Or you will have to somehow tie the cooler, but many do not have any wires laid over the memory, and cases are often made without racks for disks, so the option with racks looks preferable. Those who claim that in games the load on the memory will not be less than in a stress test are blatantly lying. Memory can work with a variable frequency, just like the processor, and if it is not necessary to fry it at full capacity, it will not do this. That is, for example, in games, the temperature of the sensors will be, for example, 32 degrees, and in the memory test, 52 degrees. This is a very noticeable 20 degrees, but large bloggers are apparently more interested in scaring their viewers, horrifying them with what will happen to their memory if they do not use active cooling, so that they listen to them carefully because they use venerable bloggers did not figure out how to overclock DDR5 standard RAM, which means that others will not figure it out either, because they are not made with a finger as they think. but in reality it may not be necessary to use active cooling, as in the case of paired operation of video card. The load on the memory varies greatly, and if your game fits in the video memory, then it will not need to constantly drive gigabytes of data at the same time. An adequately configured processor from only 1 undervolt gets a reduction in consumption by about half. And in the mode with 2 video cards, and even less consumption becomes. And in the game, the consumption is just ridiculous, which can be seen in the game test videos. There are numbers that they're not so that no one can figure out what is happening, but for a clear demonstration of the capabilities of hybrid graphics, although it is the hybrid mode of operation of the video card with integrated graphic that has already been cut even by Intel, but this does not prevent the discrete video card from showing all its agility. And if the processor in the game consumes on average about 9 watts, then it does not need to strain the memory much. This load grows only with a large number of frames, in addition to the overload of the system by swapping from RAM by the video card. It's just that those who did the RAM test do not understand the architecture of the computer and the operation of its components together at all. That's why they don't know that memory can also reduce frequencies. And using video cards as an example, you can clearly see this in the readings of some program. For example, when entering a game in the lobby, when the load is several times lower, then the memory frequency are also lower, because the video card understands that there is no need for maximum frequencies and the video memory is not strained, just like the RAM, reducing frequencies and as a result consumption and heating. The same thing happens if the video card has a lot of power and the number of frames issued by the game is limited by vertical synchronization with a frequency of, for example, 60 Hz. And since fast memory supplies data to the video card faster, it has more time to rest, which in the case of overclocking in Gear 1 allows it not to overheat, since the actual voltage is lower than that used in Gear 1 or in Gear 2 mode when the memory is working, but the memory controller is not. But it is necessary to support the memory, that is the actual load becomes lower for a reason, and although the delays for writing can be quite high, the memory controller easily copes with this, and the speed of writing and copying is still higher than just the speed of reading from the memory. That is, there is no particular sense in worrying about high writing timings, which is what micron memory suffers from. But of course, it is better to have lower delays, and the relative consumption of its bandwidth as a result can be reduced by overclocking the memory, which adds the number of frames per second. And having, for example, 60 frames, you can have a quieter and more productive computer at the same time, not to mention the fact that the cost of a computer for games due to the paired operation of video cards does not increase, but on the contrary decreases, since the requirements for the processor and video cards sharply fall due to the increase in the efficiency of all subsystems in such scenario. And in addition, productivity can also increase if the engine allows it and is not tightly nailed to some one slow main process. Some engines are simply unable to adequately distribute the load, and it seems that the game requires a 5 times more powerful processor if you look at the power consumption of not very adequate bloggers. In fact, the same game can work with much lower consumption on a smaller number of cores, with almost the same speed at a lower processor frequency, with a difference of about 1 or 2 frames per second due to the difference in the size of the processor cache. For games that do not understand what is happening and try to fill all the cores with their garbage activity, there is an option to limit the number of cores used for them and thereby reduce their processor power consumption to an optimal minimum. And if, for example, the memory gives advantage an additional 20% of frames, then this allows you to reduce the frequency and voltage on the video card, for example by 1000 MHz on the chip, and making an offset of minus 90 millivolts. You can get 3 times less consumption of the video card with a performance of only a third less, which paired with the adequate memory settings, that is when using Gear 1, even without overclocking, gives almost the same number of frames, but without the harsh strain of all the forces of the video card, and accordingly without the additional hum of air cooling, which is a rule is not designed for long-term operation of productive video cards, because thermal expansion and contraction leads to the fact that over time, after a warranty period, an expensive video card chips falls off the substrate. Those, without losing the number of frames when they are limited by the monitor, you can get a passively cooled video card, which beyond a productive solution can work on not 1 or 2 years but much longer. This is in its own way a revolution in the perception of memory overclocking, since usually all efforts are thrown at maximum performance, which in fact is not required, because a paired configuration can mainly be found only in laptops. And such a seemingly small action in meaning carries much more even without using overclocking. If, for example, the game does not respond to memory overclocking at all, and for you, for example, the base 5600 MHz is quite enough to maintain the warranty, on the other hand, and the stability of the system on the other hand, extending the service life of our productive video cards. Yes, this is a more balanced approach, but no one forbids you to use it if you want, since in fact the memory overclocking is not performant in this case. The voltage on the system agent remains the same, and the memory controller simply works in the optimal mode. Although, for some reason, the inclusion of a full-fledged memory operating mode is in the overclocking section, although this is not overclocking at all. All systems operate in nominal modes, and if, for example, a memory module designed to operate at a frequency of 5000 600 MHz breaks, then on the AMD platform it would work in the Gear 1 mode anyway, because the BIOS itself includes an adequate memory operating mode. It is impossible to say exactly why everything was distorted in the firmware of motherboards on the Intel platform, but most likely this is a policy of guaranteeing the minimum operability of the hardware without taking on any obligations for the adequate operation of the connected memory. You can also call it a quiet computer operating mode. Thus, memory heating is also reduced, and this allows you to build a passively cooled computer in games, even with a fairly hot processor. But a passive cooler for the processor is a rarity, and the only option that comes to mind is the rather expensive Noctua NHP1. However, if someone wants it to be quiet, at least at night, this becomes possible without any special compromises in terms of gaming speeds. Thus, the cost of the fans in the case should also be taken into account when building a cooling system, and you can still leave a couple of fans that will only turn on at high temperatures on the processor, which can also work passively until it reaches a high temperature. But the size of the chip in the processor is usually much smaller than the size of the video chip, and it is not particularly at the risk of failure, although with chiplet layouts it is difficult to say how durable they are, but in theory such processors can be much more resistant to temperature changes. Cleft modulus are probably more preferable, although they are difficult to get and the sticker is right on the memory, but with the CDIMM output, the 6000 MHz bar, and the memory of this manufacturer is capable of operating at such frequency at standard voltage, was probably overcome, since the standard voltage depends on the process technology and the quality of the boards themselves. With the large number of layers of textilite with high quality insulation of these layers, and given the heating of the modulus when the standard voltage is exceeded in Gear 1 mode, it is the quality of execution and the process technology that comes to the fore. However, someone may be more interested in taking 4 chip modulus of 32 gigabytes if their speed is sufficient. If the memory is cooled at high frequencies while working at full capacity, this calls into question the need for systems with the memory controller separated from the substrate with cores, as is done in AMD and on the LGA1851 socket, because in addition to this, games on Linux can work faster on Intel due to a more advanced scheduler, and here the influence of high quality memory overclocking can be even higher than on Windows, when both the processor and memory show their real maximum. In general, the scheduler in Linux is quite simple, and with maximum priority for the process, almost the entire load falls on the productive cores, thus the delay is reduced to a minimum and memory overclocking, as well as a configuration with 2 video cards, as well as the use of launch keys work together, increasing performance to the maximum. Thus, the appearance of cut down productive cores paired with enhanced small cores on Linux in the LGA1851 socket is absolutely nothing good, since 8 productive cores are more important for games and the execution of the second instruction stream increases performance while the core is idle when waiting for data from RAM. Working at the maximum frequency is not necessary, since when the p-state is enabled, the frequencies in games are much lower than those usually demonstrated in overclocking. And even at 4800 MHz, they do not even come close to reaching the maximum load on one core. And if the game allows it, then acceleration is achieved precisely due to the configuration of paired video cards and memory overclocking. A fixed frequency can give a difference of 1 frame, but in practice, when there are 100 frames on the screen, this is essentially no difference, which can be observed in the game test. That is, the importance of the processors is greatly overstated artificially, as is the importance of having one super powerful video card. Emphasis on RAM turns out to be the simplest option for developing performance in monetary terms. That is, it is more effective up to a certain level. And here even fans of powerful video cards will not let you lie. With maximum ray tracing settings, even top video cards give in and do not always give 60 frames per second. And on Linux, in a number of games, when even processors with 3D cache can be equal or lag behind Intel processors released 5 years ago. More accurate data will require to use of all system capabilities when using the appropriate hardware, but hardware and programs require detailed settings and not just turning on all visual options for maximum image quality at maximum overclocking in a configuration not intended for games using only one video card. Those bloggers themselves sabotage changes in people's understanding, although they should demonstrate how it will be better, because it is more important for people to have an idea of how to do better for themselves. Instead, many other bloggers are busy with exercises with crooked configurations in the style of how to squeeze the maximum out of the integrated video card, although its capacity is more than enough for the desktop video decoding and rendering windows in the browser by the video card, but for heavy games their performance may be completely insufficient, no matter how they stretch on an oval on a globe. The most crazy ones fill the public space with loud names about what they did not did, littering the public space with their nonsense, and in the end only very persistent or lucky people can dig up something real in this mountain of garbage. Therefore, you will have to draw conclusions yourself, because you can use the understanding of how DDR5 works on the LGA1700 socket platform in different ways, or not use it because the manufacturer does not provide a guarantee, which means no one does. Everything is like fleas in a jar that have been covered with a lid. New generations of fleas will not even try to jump above the lid, which seems to them to be the ceiling in this case, the ceiling of productivity and efficiency, because when the hardware works straight, it either works faster or consumes less because it is idle. If the quality of the game code leaves much to be desired, but in the case of those who invested in the development of the game engine performance, they show an increase in performance both from the use of paired operation of video cards and from the use of overclocked RAM. But most often, overclocking the RAM closes the weak points of the game engine and does not overclock the performance as in the case of paired operation of video cards. And together with a competent undervolt, this is altogether increases performance, because even if the processor cannot be overclocked but the load is high, for example on vector instruction blocks, then undervolting allows you to move the bar for triggering the performance ceiling, since half the consumption means that the threshold for triggering the limit will not occur, and this is also a kind of overclocking of processors with blocked overclocking, while the memory is involved in all processes and its speed may not be enough for particularly crooked engines of modern games. It is not a fact that it is worth driving the memory in the fireman mode with a wild increase in voltage in Gear 2 mode for this. But if there is no choice, then you will have to be content with the little. Although it is possible to unload the memory from excessive voltage while getting the same performance. Only people usually do not dream of their computer working well and for a long time, because it has more than enough power for games, because marketers constantly throw in the idea that it is time to update. But whether it is necessary to do this when the processor consumes 1/7 of the maximum consumption level is a big question. In fact, almost nothing changes from the difference of several frames, but the memory adds the total number of frames and not the percentage as it usually happens. That is, if the memory adds 20 frames when overclocking, then the video card needs to strain less when the total number of frames is 60, because a third of the frames are lost when the data does not arrive on in time. That is, some of the video card blocks are strained in vain. That is, the goal is, let's say, to get the maximum playable 60 frames, but at the same time the input delay or input lag makes this mode perceived by many as uncomfortable. They think that twice as many frames will help them, but hybrid graphics already, let's say, reduces the overall delay by a quarter, and not just the delay in the displaying a frame on the monitor, which makes the 60Hz mode quite comfortable, although this is unusual for those who have long been showed numbers in their noses that are several times larger and declared that this is cool and everything else is just crap from under the fingernails. Here, everything is the same, as in the case of doubling the speed of the memory controller. The delay is reduced, and you get a real delay, and not a slow mode as it usually happens on systems with the video card, when the video card does twice as much, dragging 2 processes instead of 1. 2 is exactly twice as much as 1. And here the truth comes out, which has a tendency to show up sooner or later. A paired configuration of video cards, undervolting and overclocking of RAM with overclocking of the memory controller are the most effective solutions, and that is why they are not advertised. It is not profitable if a person buys a processor once every 15 years because he has more than enough. That is why the multi-core race has been stuck at around 4 cores for many years. Intel then claimed that 4 cores would be enough for everyone. As it turned out, this was true. This does not mean that powerful multi-core processors are unnecessary, but for games, they are rather redundant and do not bring any special advantages when used. Nvidia tried to promote configurations of several video cards, but of course this is expensive and ineffective. It is much more effective to combine a cheap integrated video card with a full-fledged single video card, because it is not necessary to shoot sparrows with a cannon. This moderation from some side leads to an increase in productivity or, if desired, efficiency when undervolting the video card where it is needed. The computer can work many times faster, and RAM is no exception, and those who want can arrange this for themselves, because there is no need to buy an expensive RAM to overclock it at the frequency of the memory controller, or not overclock it and get a stable, fast system. Both options are correct depending on your desires. If twice as many people become happier, then twice as many people will become stronger. At the very least, they do not need to participate in a wild race for survival called buy a new computer at least once a year. When the power is more than enough, and to fully experience what input lag is, you will probably have to change something in your system. After all, people are usually accustomed to the smooth operation of the mouse when you need to make fairly large movement with your hands. In fact, the mouse is adapted to make very sharp movements, because what difference does it make how many frames are on the monitor if, say, 600 milliseconds are spent on movement and aiming? That is more than half a second. It does not matter whether you have 60 frames on the screen or 240, because the input lag will be tiny in such a situation. But if you turn on the maximum sensitivity of the mouse, for example 8200 dpi, and turn off mouse acceleration, then you will get the real speed. Almost the same can be obtained by slowing down the sensor, working at value of 42,000 dpi with a real speed of 20% of this value. You will get almost the same. The internal polling frequency of the sensor can be 150 in the first case and 650 in the second. The frequency of 1000 Hz, that is a delay of 1 millisecond, will not occur immediately and will turn on after some run-up, because the mouse also does not work constantly at the maximum polling frequency, and turning on the maximum value as required for the mouse to fully work as quickly as possible, that is, its input lag decreased several times. After this, in the game, you should increase the sensitivity to about 2.2 in Quake Champions, and learn to control the mouse at high speed. Over time, when you learn to control the mouse at high speed, you will still you will use your fingers more, and the accuracy will not decrease but increase. The reaction will also increase, since you will have to play in a collected state and not in a smeared state to hit. And only after this does the number of frames begins to affect. You can see this in the statistics of hits from a railgun and battles with bots on the same map, that is in more or less the same conditions. That's when the number of frames will start to add accuracy with sharp movements. And this is exactly what the performance of video card and high hertz monitor is used for. And later you can use the potential of the hardware above 86 Hz depends on you. Textures in games have almost no effect on performance in games, unlike shaders and ray tracing. But I think there will be those who only pay attention to the quality of the picture, and they will not get anything out of this video. But if you understand that the teacher does not necessarily have to have clothes from an expensive brand to have a reason to learn something from him, then you will not need a demonstration of the work of only a top-end video card to understand what and how it works. And for those who like to squeeze the maximum out of the system, there will be more videos, including how to make the fastest possible sound output, which can be useful in games, because in addition to the network delay, there is also a sound subsystem that usually works in the media center mode. It's sharpened for lazy sound output, which is predictably needed when playing video clips. But this mode is not designed for competitive shooters when a delay of 20 milliseconds matters. And of course there will be a separate video about a full-fledged undervolt as a response to those who say that Intel is a stove. I am not a fan of the Blue Company at all. My choice of this platform was based only on the fact that the memory controller and cores are located on the same substrate, and there were no other options with DDR5 at that time. Besides, even simple memory on Intel can be quite fast. And this is far from the limit of the memory controller, and there is room to develop the platform's performance. This was Evgeny with you. See you soon on the channel.